Hello, good morning. Welcome to our final project video where we're gonna show you the different stages of our project. So, the first part of the project was the mini-metal foundry that was built at the beginning of the semester. So, the step one was to break in with German force the bottle that we were gonna use in order to mix the sand. The second step, this was kind of necessary, but it was necessary for us since we had to clean the bucket. So we cleaned the bucket since it had some glue in it. And after cleaning the bucket, we started with the actual process. So we did the mixture, 1.5 buckets of sand, 1.5 buckets of plaster, and 3/4 buckets of water. So we poured the different components into the bucket that we're gonna use to do the mixture, and we started the mixture, and we started mixing for actually a long time. It takes a long time for it to mix. And after mixing the components for quite a while, we pour the mix into the steel bucket, and we insert a plastic bucket in order to make the hole. So there's our mix composed of sand, plaster, and water. And we put in the bucket here. One mistake was to leave the handle of the bucket, but either way, it was good enough. So we waited for a long time, for a really long time, holding the bucket into the metal bucket. So then we remove it after it is dry with some tools. And then we have the main part of our mini metal foundry. So the next part was to follow the same steps to create the donut that covers or that acts as a lid, but here we need to put some handles so we can manipulate it easily. So there we have our donut, and then we start drilling the hole in order to give some ventilation to our mini metal foundry. Through that hole we're gonna put the hot air. So we drill the hole with a drill. We had to drill multiple times in order to create a hole that was big enough for our metal tube. And then we connect the PVC to the metal tube with a coupler. And the next part was to tape the hairdryer to the end of the PVC tube. We recommend to use something to hold the hairdryer, because if not, the PVC tube it's gonna fall and fold, and the hairdryer is gonna fall. And then we actually started with the fire in our mini metal foundry, as we can see in the image. And then when the fire it's already started, we put the clisol into the mini metal foundry to start the melting of the cans. We cover it with the lid in order to create like a closed environment for the fire to grow, and then we see how our mini metal foundry is starting to heat up. So we can see there's already a little bit of aluminum there, and the general setup of the foundry should look something like this: the hair dryer, the tubes, the donut, the bucket, everything assembled together. And last but not least, starting melting. can by can, as it's important to maintain the fire alive. Every once in a while, put some more charcoal or change it. And after a couple of cans, well, not a couple, but maybe some 50 to 60 cans, we already melt the sufficient amount of aluminum in order to create our delicious aluminum cupcakes. So there we can see the melting of the can in our mini metal foundry. At the beginning it's slow, but as the fire increases, it becomes easier. So finally we pour the molten aluminum to the cupcake mold to create our delicious aluminum cupcakes. There's the molten aluminum, and then we pour it in our mold. Those scrap over there are the remainings of the of painting of the cans. And well, that's it for the first phase of our project. We're gonna proceed with the second phase.
So hello, welcome to our phase number 2 of our project, Lowe's foam casting process. And the materials to use for this phase of the project are the following. We're gonna use our previous setup that we built in the phase number 1, some cans in order to melt more aluminum, also the previous melted cupcakes, sand, the bucket in order to make our Lowe's foam casting, and some cutting tools to cut our piece, and some glue in order to create our shape. The first step was to melt again. So the first part was to put our setup again, put some newspaper and some fire in order to melt these cans, then add some charcoal in order to create or to initiate our mini metal foundry. Finally, after some cans that we melt, we created more cupcakes, pouring it in our tray in order to produce new cupcakes that we're gonna use to do our Lowe's foam casting process. And finally, we got 5 cupcakes. So we made a couple of tries. Our first try was with foam or foamy. So what we did was to get a template for a knife from internet pictures, and we started cutting our template so that we can, after cutting it, trace it in our foam, and after tracing it, cutting it. In order to create our shape, we need multiple of these foamies, that after that we're gonna glue them together in order to give it volume. And we also have different kinds of foamies, since we have different layers. So we have 2 layers that we're gonna put together to build the main body of the knife, and 2 other layers that are the edges of our shape that will create the handle effect. So after putting it together and having our final shape with its respective riser, we start pouring some sand in our bucket, more or less half or even less of the bucket. And after that, we put our shape, our knife, our foamy knife, into the bucket, and then fill with sand. It was important to maintain the shape straight in order to ensure that our casting was also straight. That was kind of difficult in this part of the process. And once we had our shape sunk into the sand, we created a volcano or a little mountain with the help and the use of water, so that aluminum maintains there and doesn't go to the edge of the bucket. And so we did our first right after melting the cupcakes. And the results were not favorable since the ricer was consumed really fast and didn't get to the main body of the piece. So this trial was our first fail. However, we decided to make a second try. In the second try, we decided to use a different kind of material, unicel, or hielo seco in Spanish. So we used the same template and we cut it the pieces, but now in unicel. The different layers, the main body of the knife and also the smaller ones that we're gonna use to give the handle effect. We cut them precisely and then put them together with some glue. And after that we define just the details in order to achieve a successful knife shape that's smooth. We created a hole in our bucket using the same sand in order to put our unicel piece there. And then we put our piece and cover it with sand, leaving space just for the ricer to come out. And again, sprinkle some water in order to create our volcano. We create our volcano and we sprinkle again some water. And no, we're not blessing the piece, praying for it to work. And then we put our metal foundry, our wonderful and incredible foundry, to run again. Melt the cupcakes again. And then finally pour the molten aluminum into the volcano. And after waiting for a couple of minutes for it to solidify, we came out with our beautiful, incredible knife that has several layers and that's smooth. So this is the process to create a lost foam casting. Thank you for your attention, and don't forget, Star Wars rocks.
So welcome to our phase 3 of our project, that is sand casting and machining. So what we did first was the machining part, in which we took our piece from phase number 2 and we removed the initiator that we used in the last phase. Then we polish it a little bit, and using milling we made it to have fine details and to be smooth and to remove all the roughness from the surface. This piece was the one that we were gonna use as a pattern for sand casting, and so this was our final piece. As you can see, it's pretty smooth. It's pretty nice. And this was the one that we used in order to do the sand casting, which was the next part of our project. The first part was to do our own flask. This because the flask in the lab were really small, so we started cutting the wood in order to create this flask. So we created this really nice flask with some screws, and this was the flask that we were gonna use for sand casting. The first part after doing the flask was to prepare the sand, and so we grabbed some sand, we filter it so we could just get the smallest grains from the sand. And then we also had some bentonite, which is the one that Marcelino is pouring in the base. And after pouring a certain quantity of bentonite, what we did was to mix it. So we started mixing it first. ensuring that the bentonite and the sand were correctly mixed, and then we add some water, and then we start mixing again and letting it getting dry for a couple of minutes. And after that we started putting it in our flask. So we put the knife in the bottom of the flask, and then we started putting some sand over it and compacting the sand so it actually resists as a whole, that it doesn't break down easily. So after pouring a lot of sand and doing that for both parts of our flask, having finished with both parts of the flask, what we did was to put on our mini metal foundry to melt some aluminum, and then pour it in our flask that we made the riser. And we poured the metal into the hole down a channel. As we can see there in the picture, there's a little channel of aluminum that was previously just space. And then we removed our piece from the mold, getting our final knife. So actually this process was a little bit less satisfying, the result. This due to the fact that we think that there was the creation of bubbles because of some space. And here we have the comparison between our two different knives. So thank you very much, and